We're going to examine the historical use of journalists, artists, and cultural producers by intelligence organizations as vectors for narrative influence and information gathering. Using principles from behavioral science, cognitive psychology, system theory, and organizational strategy, this argues that the migration of influence operations from traditional media to decentralized digital platforms represents a structural evolution. The probability of intelligence presence within social media ecosystems is assessed through incentive analysis, network leverage theory, and cost-benefit modeling. However, without attributing agency to specific actors or accounts. Modern intelligence organizations are tasked not only with collecting classified information, they are also tasked with shaping strategic environments. Historically, this has included influence over public perception, elite discourse, and cultural narratives. During the mid-20th century, intelligence agencies recognized mass media and cultural production as critical domains of geopolitical competition. This recognition gave rise to covert and semi-covert relationships with journalists, writers, musicians, and filmmakers. The emergence of the internet and social media has fundamentally altered the architecture of information dissemination. However, the strategic, logic underpinning of influence operations remains constant. We'll investigate why cultural intermediaries were historically effective tools for intelligence operations, the scientific principles that explain their effectiveness, and why contemporary digital platforms present an even more advantageous environment for similar influence strategies. In a historical context, media was used as a strategic infrastructure. So, one, media as an instrument of power. During the Cold War, information was increasingly recognized as a strategic resource. Control over narratives allowed states to influence foreign publics, domestic opinion, and allied decision-makers without direct military engagement. Journalists and cultural figures occupied positions of epistemic authority, meaning their representation of reality were often accepted as credible and neutral. And then the structural advantage of journalistic cover. Journalists and cultural producers offered a unique operational advantage, legitimate access to restricted environments, and routine engagement with political and military elites. Also, legal and professional justification for inquiry, and plausible deniability for intelligence-related activities. So from an organizational standpoint, these professions neutrally overlapped with intelligence functions, such as information acquisition, synthesis, and dissemination. When it comes to behavioral and cognitive foundations of influence, we have authority bias. And authority bias refers to the tendency of individuals to attribute greater accuracy and legitimacy to information delivered by perceived experts or trusted institutions. Journalists, academics, and artists benefit from this bias due to their socially sanctioned roles as interpreters of reality. Then there's narrative cognition. Human cognition is predominantly narrative-based rather than data-driven. So information that is embedded in stories is processed more efficiently, it's retained longer, and it's integrated into moral reasoning more deeply than abstract fact. Cultural products, films, articles, music, they all function as narrative delivery systems that bypass analytical resistance. And then there's the social proof and consensus formation. So repeated exposure to similar frames across multiple cultural channels generates perceived consensus. This phenomenon, sometimes described as emerged belief formation, does not require centralized control, but instead relies on reinforcing signals across social systems. There is the systems theory and intelligence strategy. Network leverage versus total control. So intelligence organizations do not require comprehensive dominance over information systems. Systems theory demonstrates that influencing key modes within a network can generate cascading effects. Cultural elites and media gatekeepers historically functioned as such nodes. And second, in the system theory and intelligence strategy, would come the cost-benefit efficiency. Influence operations through media are comparatively low cost and high impact. They avoid the risks associated with kinetic operations while offering long-term strategic benefits by shaping identity, ideology, and institutional norms. There's a structural transformation in the digital era. From centralized media to distributed networks. The internet dismantled centralized gatekeeping structures and replaced them with decentralized, algorithm-driven networks. So while this increased participation, it also introduced new leverage points. Those leverage points would be algorithmic amplification, virality dynamics, micro-influencers, and pseudonymous identity structures. And there's behavioral feedback loops. Social media platforms provide real-time behavioral data, enabling rapid testing and optimization of narratives. From an intelligence science perspective, this constitutes a feedback-controlled influence environment, surpassing traditional media in speed and adaptability. When making a probability assessment of intelligence presence on social media, we would have to think of the incentive-based reasoning, which organizational behavior theory holds that rational actors exploit environments offering maximal return. Social media platforms offer massive audience reach, low operational cost, high anonymity and deniability, and detailed psychological and network data. So given these conditions, abstention from digital influence operations would represent strategic negligence, in my opinion. So then we look at the functional role equivalents. The roles historically filled by journalists and cultural figures can now be replicated functionally by anonymous or pseudonymous accounts, by influencers and content creators, by community moderators, and by comment section opinion leaders. So although the identities differ, the influence function remains unchanged. It's important to distinguish presence from dominance. So the presence of intelligence-linked activity does not imply comprehensive control over online discourse. And most content remains organic. Influence operations typically target specific narratives, audiences, or decision-critical moments rather than attempting total saturation. This analysis does not assert that all media or social media participants are agents of intelligence organizations. Such assumptions would be analytically unsound and empirically unsupported. Instead, this emphasizes structural probability and strategic incentives rather than individual attribution. The historical use of journalists, artists, and culture producers by intelligence organizations was not anomalous but strategically rational, grounded in well-established principles of human cognition and social systems. The transition to internet-based platforms represents an evolution in delivery mechanisms rather than a departure from core doctrine. Given the alignment between intelligence objectives and the affordance of social media ecosystems, the probability of intelligence engagement within these environments is very high. This engagement is best understood as selective, network-based influence rather than omnidirectional control. Ultimately, the digital information environment has become the modern equivalent of Cold War-era cultural terrain. More decentralized, more data-rich, and more behaviorally transparent. Now let's look at the psychological and structural dynamics of internet-enabled crime and intelligence utilization of online environments. The internet has altered the psychological landscape of criminal behavior by introducing anonymity, scale, and reduced social feedback, thereby lowering traditional barriers to deviant actions. Concurrently, these same affordances create environments that are strategically valuable for intelligence and security organizations who are conducting monitoring, infiltration, and influence activities. And now we'll analyze 1. The cognitive and behavioral psychological underlying internet-enabled crime. 2. The typology of online bad actors from a psychological perspective. And 3. The structural reasons intelligence organizations, including but not limited to the CIA, would rationally operate within social media ecosystems using covert or semi-covert roles. This analysis emphasizes system theory, incentive structures, and behavioral science rather than the operational detail. Digital networks have transformed human interaction by decoupling behavior from physical presence. This transformation has implications for both criminal activity and intelligence operations. While the internet lowers barriers to antisocial behavior, it simultaneously provides unprecedented visibility into social networks, belief formation, and behavioral trends. Understanding the psychology of online crime therefore requires a dual analysis: the individual cognitive mechanisms that enable deviance and the institutional logic that motivates intelligence engagement in these environments. Looking at the psychological foundation of internet-enabled crime, one of the biggest things is that online environments reduce identifiability, producing de-individuation. This is a psychological state in which self-awareness and accountability are diminished. Research in social psychology shows that de-individuation lowers inhibition, it weakens moral self-regulation, and it increases rule-breaking behavior. The perceived absence of consequences alters cost-benefit calculations, even when legal risk objectively remains. When identifying a confidential informant, analysts typically seek individuals who occupy positions that naturally grant access to information that is relevant to a covert study or operation. Effective intelligence collection in such context depends not only on access, but also on interpersonal compatibility. Establishing trust, rapport, and cooperative chemistry is essential, and this process often resembles the gradual formation of a friendship rather than a transactional exchange. As a result, covert analysts or operatives commonly engage in relationship-building behaviors, including asking neutral, personal questions designed to understand how an individual perceives themselves and the world around them. These questions are not trivial. They function as cognitive and identity probes. For example, I was familiar with a covert analyst who attempted to build rapport with an individual that they believed could become a valuable asset to an ongoing covert study. During an early interaction, the analyst asked a simple, open-ended question: "What is your favorite color?" The individual responded with, "Pay attention." This response immediately signaled a psychological phenomenon that is consistent with de-individuation. Rather than answering the question as an individual, by recalling a personal, pre-social preference rooted in childhood aesthetics or sensory appeal, the individual reframed the question through a group-based ideology lens. The concept of favorite color was interpreted not as a personal preference, but as a symbolic reference to a political or social identity. For an analyst, this type of response is diagnostically informative. It reveals not only how the individual constructs meaning, but also reveals the degree to which their cognition has been externalized to group narratives. An important factor is assessing reliability, autonomy of thought, and suitability for confidential collaboration. Psychological distance and moral disengagement would be second in the psychological foundation of internet-enabled crime. Digital interaction introduces psychological distance between action and harm. This facilitates moral disengagement, allowing individuals to minimize perceived damage, dehumanize victims, and reframe actions as abstract or victimless. Such mechanisms are particularly relevant in cybercrime, fraud, harassment, and disinformation. Online systems provide immediate feedback, quantifiable rewards like shares and responses, and rapid escalation of perceived success. Neuroscientific research suggests that compressed reward loops increases risk-taking and reduces long-term ethical consideration, reinforcing repeated behavior even when it's harmful. This brings us to identity fragmentation. So the internet allows individuals to maintain multiple compartmentalized identities. This fragmentation reduces identity-based guilt. It enables role switching between lawful and unlawful behavior, and it encourages experimentation with antisocial roles. This is not pathology, but an emergent property of digital identity systems. There's a typology of online bad actors from a psychological perspective. And this addresses behavioral categories, not labels of criminal culpability. One being the opportunistic actors. They are motivated by low effort and perceived low risk. Often, things escalate gradually, and behavior is situational rather than ideological. Two would be the instrumental actors, and they are goal-driven, usually by financial, reputational, or ideological reasons. They rationalize actions through utilitarian logic. They frequently exploit system weaknesses rather than individuals. Three would be ideologically motivated actors. They anchor identity to belief systems. They view actions as morally justified, and they're resistant to counter-narrative due to identity fusion. And number four would be networked actors. They operate within loosely connected online communities. They usually benefit from diffusion of responsibility, and often they are unaware of the full scope of collective harm. When it comes to the structural affordances of social media for intelligence activity, well, intelligence objectives in digital environments, modern intelligence mandates would include threat detection, network mapping, influence assessment, and early warning indicators of instability. So these objectives are observational and analytical as much as operational. There are reasons why social media is strategically valuable. From a systems science perspective, social media platforms provide dense social graphs, real-time sentiment data, behavioral pattern visibility, and emergent leader identification. These properties make online spaces uniquely informative for understanding both criminal and non-criminal collective behavior. Historically, intelligence agencies embedded within journalism, academia, and cultural institutions. Functionally, social media replaces these roles by enabling persona-based observation, community-level engagement, and narrative tracking without centralized gatekeepers. This represents functional continuity, not categorical expansion. When it comes to intelligence interaction with online criminal ecosystems, it would be observation rather than control. Intelligence engagement typically emphasizes monitoring trends, identifying key nodes, and understanding pathways of radicalization or coordination. Most intelligence value derives from passive presence, not active manipulation. The system theory demonstrates that understanding a network requires proximity to its communication channels. Intelligence organizations therefore prioritize access to discourse, visibility into group norms, and mapping influence dynamics. This does not imply omnipresence or universal infiltration. Criminal actors use anonymity to evade accountability. Intelligence entities use similar environments to reduce information asymmetry, to anticipate threats, and to assess social risk. The same technological affordances serves opposing goals, depending on institutional incentives. This analysis does not attribute criminality to online users. It does not assert total surveillance or control, and it does not imply that intelligence agencies direct most online behavior. Most online activity is organic, like I've previously said. Intelligence activity is selective, constrained, and probabilistic. The internet amplifies both antisocial opportunity and institutional observation capacity. Psychological mechanisms that enable online crime, anonymity, moral disengagement, and reward acceleration, are inseparable from the same features that make digital spaces analytically valuable to intelligence organizations. This dual-use nature creates tension between privacy, security, and social trust. Understanding these dynamics requires moving beyond conspiracy framing towards behavioral systems analysis, where outcomes emerge from structure rather than intent. Internet-enabled crime is best understood as the interaction between human cognitive vulnerabilities and technologically mediated environments. Intelligence engagement in these same environments follows rational institutional logic rather than exceptional deviation from historical practices. Both phenomena arise from the same underlying transformation: the migration of social behavior into observable, scalable, and psychologically distinct digital networks. This applies systems theory to model the psychological, technological, and institutional dynamics of internet-enabled crime and intelligence engagement in social media environments. By conceptualizing online platforms as complex, adaptive systems, the analysis identifies key subsystems, feedback loops, attractor states, and leverage points that explain both criminal behavior and intelligence presence without resorting to conspiratorial assumptions or operational descriptions. System boundary definition is macro system, the global digital information ecosystem, and it includes social media platforms, users, which is the general population, criminal actors, intelligence and security organizations, algorithms, and legal and normative frameworks. This is an open system, continuous information inflow and outflow, nonlinear interactions, and adaptive behavior over time. The first core subsystem would be Human Cognitive Subsystem, HCS, and the components are attention, identity, moral reasoning, reward processing, and threat perception. Key properties would be bounded rationality, narrative-driven cognition, and susceptibility to authority bias and social proof. The second subsystem is the Platform Algorithmic Subsystem, or PAS. Its components are recommendation algorithms, engagement metrics, moderation systems, and data collection pipelines. Key properties would be optimization towards engagement, feedback amplification, opacity, and scale invariance. The third subsystem would be the Criminal Behavior Subsystem, or the CBS. The components are opportunistic offenders, instrumental offenders, ideological offenders, and networked offenders. Key properties would be exploits anonymity and distance, operates in adaptive clusters, responds to perceived risk, not actual risk, and evolves through selection pressure. And the fourth subsystem would be Intelligence and Security Subsystem, which is ISS. The components are observation units, analytical models, influence assessment teams, and counter-threat monitoring. Key properties would be selective engagement, risk-averse optimization, network-based rather than individual-based logic, operates under legal and political constraints. There are key system interactions. So when HCS interacts with PAS, which is cognitive and algorithmic coupling, algorithms shape attention. Attention trains algorithms, and this creates reinforcing feedback loops, resulting in salience inflation, emotional amplification, and reduced deliberative processing. When PAS and CBS, which is opportunity amplification loop, their platform affordances lower friction. Criminal behavior adapt to platform rules, and successful behaviors are imitated. This creates the feedback loop. So low friction to increased attempts, to algorithmic visibility, to norm erosion, to more attempts. This produces crime attractor states in certain digital niches. CBS and HCS coupling is a moral disengagement loop. De-individuation reduces self-regulation. Identity fragmentation allows role separation, and success reinforces rationalization. This loop actually stabilizes antisocial behavior without requiring pathology. ISS and PAS coupling creates an observational and signal extraction loop. Intelligence monitors open systems. Algorithms provide behavioral signals, and intelligence adapts models based on platform dynamics. This is a passive dominant loop. Most value is derived from observation, not intervention. ISS and CBS coupling creates network mapping loop. Intelligence identifies clusters and nodes. Criminal networks adapt to perceived scrutiny, and intelligence recalibrates focus. This creates co-evolution, not unilateral control. Then there's feedback loops, so reinforcing positive loops. Engagement to visibility equals behavioral repetition. Anonymity leads to moral disengagement, which leads to risk-taking. Narrative alignment leads to group cohesion, which leads to escalation. And balancing negative loops would be legal enforcement to perceived risk to behavioral suppression. Moderation to friction to platform migration. Exposure to counter-narratives to normal correction. System behavior emerges from loop dominance, not centralized intent. So there's an emergence of influence nodes. Influence concentrates around high engagement accounts, community moderators, and narrative framers. These nodes arise organically, but they do become systematically important to both criminals and intelligence observers. Then there's the emergence of shadow norms. Repeated behavior normalizes minor fraud, harassment, disinformation, boundary-pushing conduct. Norm shifts occur without explicit coordination. Intelligence presence might be seen as a stabilizing subsystem. Contrary to conspiracy models, intelligence engagement often acts as a dampening mechanism, an early warning sensor, and a risk containment function. This role is strictly reactive, not omnipotent. The system tends towards several semi-stable states. 1. High engagement / low trust. 2. High visibility / low accountability. 3. Rapid narrative cycling. And 4. Persistent low-level antisocial activity. Attempts to eliminate these entirely tend to destabilize adjacent subsystems. From systems theory, the high-impact leverage points include algorithmic incentive structures, identity persistence mechanisms, friction at critical decision points, transparency of feedback signals. Low-impact leverage points include individual account removal and content whack-a-mole strategies. Intelligence presence is structurally inevitable, given high information densities, predictive behavioral data, network visibility, and the low-cost observation. The ISS naturally couples to PAS. Non-coupling would increase uncertainty and strategic blind spots, violating institutional optimization principles. You have to be careful to avoid system misinterpretations that lead to conspiracy thinking. Conspiracy framing arises when emergent order is mistaken for centralized control, when feedback loops are mistaken for intent, when opacity is mistaken for secrecy, and scale is mistaken for omnipotence. Systems theory resolves this by replacing who is controlling with what is interacting. Internet-enabled crime and intelligence engagement are not opposing anomalies, but more so like co-emergent phenomenon within the same complex adaptive system. The psychological affordance that lowers barriers to online crime simultaneously generate the data and visibility that make digital environments valuable for intelligence analysts. System behavior is governed by feedback loops, incentives, and adaptation, not by singular conspiratorial control. Understanding this system requires abandoning linear causality in favor of dynamic interaction models, where the outcomes arise from structure rather than intent.